Well, let me welcome you on behalf of the Center for Educational Pluralism of the Woodring College. My name is Lorraine Kasperson. I'm the director of the center. And I'd like to make a very special welcome to all those off-campus students who have joined us today. I've heard you've come from Seattle and Bremerton and Everett and Oak Harbor, and welcome, folks. I do have a special announcement for you. Janae told me to let you know that the off-campus students who need to catch the van back to Lincoln Park and Ride, the van will leave behind Fraser Hall, that's this building, continuously between 7 and 10 o'clock. So don't worry about missing your van. You'll have plenty of time. A couple more announcements. You'll notice that on your seats there are some index cards, and you may want to, after you've listened to our lecture this evening, you may have some questions. So jot them down, and toward the end of the lecture, the staff from the CEP, the Center for Educational Pluralism, who are acting as ushers this evening, will come by and pick up the cards along the aisles, and Ginny Jo Blue, who is a staff member, will read the questions to John. I might also add, if you've noticed, we are videotaping the lecture tonight, and it will be on our website. We're also audio taping, and that will be available almost immediately. It'll be there tomorrow. The videotape usually takes a little bit longer, but everything will be up on our website, so all of you can review the lecture at your own leisure. As I said, I'd like to welcome you to our third annual Distinguished Lecture. And this marks a year-long series of events around the theme that we're calling democracy, schooling as if democracy matters. And we're just delighted this evening to have as our speaker John Goodlad, who will talk about his agenda for democracy. We're going to follow up on tonight's lecture with a series of events that will enable us to deepen, all of us together, to deepen our understanding of these issues that we're raising tonight. Tomorrow evening, for example, we're going to have a discussion as part of our bi-weekly Critical Conversation series, which will be at 6 o'clock in the CEP, and if some of you haven't been there, it's 250 Miller Hall. You will have an opportunity to discuss some of the ideas that are raised by our speaker tonight and talk about them with each other. Professor Bruce Larson from the secondary department will be facilitating the discussion, and we welcome all of you to join us. During the winter quarter, the Woodring College will be co-sponsoring the Martin Luther King Jr. Human Rights Conference. That's a conference put on by the Whatcom Human Rights Task Force, and they have decided to also call the theme of their conference the same as our theme, or almost the same. They're calling theirs Teaching as if Democracy Matters. And it's a wonderful example of adult education and democracy in progress, in practice. We're going to discuss a whole set of issues that pertain to youth, to educators, to the community. The keynote speaker for that is Gregory Mitchie, who is the author of a book called Holler If You Hear Me. Some of you may have read that. It's a book about his experiences teaching in the inner city. And he is going to be at the conference, but we've also got him to come to Woodring and the day before. And so we'll have a book seminar with the author. And if you'd like to join us, just read the book and come and talk about it with Gregory Mitchie. And then finally, during the spring quarter, our April forum this year will feature teachers from 3 schools who are part of the League of Small Democratic Schools. This is a project that was started by John Goodlad to create schools that are laboratories of democratic practices. And the teachers are going to show videos of their classes, and hopefully they will be willing to give some demonstration lessons for us. I'm looking down at some of the teachers to see if they're going to be doing that. I think it'll be a wonderful experience, and I'm pleased to inform you that the CEP through Woodring is currently partnering with one of those schools, and we're hoping to involve an additional school in the district in the near future. And then finally, after you've attended all these events this year, and even if you haven't, you will have an opportunity to read about some of these issues in the January 2008 issue of our new journal called the Journal of Educational Controversy. That issue will explore the theme of schooling as if democracy matters, and it will be dedicated to our speaker this evening, who has also agreed to write the prologue to the issue. The controversy that we posed in that issue asks us to think about how are we to fulfill the traditional moral imperative of our schools, which has been to create a public capable of sustaining the life of a democracy. You know, democracy is one of those terms that has become almost a mere platitude and media sound bites these days. It's almost devoid of meaning. And I'm reminded of a line in John Stuart Mill's classic treatise on liberty, where he defends an open society and rigorous debate of our ideals and principles, lest they become, as he puts it, quote, by most of those who receive it, held in a matter of prejudice, with little comprehension or feeling of its rational grounds. And then he goes on and says, the meaning of the doctrine itself will be in danger of being lost and enfeebled and deprived of its virtual effect on the character and conduct. The dogma becoming a mere formal profession, inefficacious for good, but cumbering the ground and preventing the growth of any real and heartfelt conviction from reason and personal experience. I love the phraseology of these 19th century writers. We just don't talk like that anymore. But we took his ideas very seriously. And so we decided we're going to ask some serious questions in our journal. How can schools create a public capable of sustaining the life of a democracy in an age of the Patriot Act, NSA surveillance, extraordinary rendition, presumptive wars, enemy combatants, all likely to involve violations of civil rights and liberties and a curtain of government secrecy? What story do we tell our young about who we are, who we have been, and who we are becoming? How do we educate children about their identity in this global world? What sense are they to make of the imperial democracy that they are inheriting? What are the implications of all these forces for the education of the young on the foundations of our democracy and our collective identity? We have invited authors from across the globe to engage with us in this conversation and to submit papers that will illuminate the many dimensions of this issue. Our speaker this evening has spent his whole professional life in pursuit of these questions. John Goodlad is Professor Emeritus and founder of the Center for Educational Renewal at the University of Washington and president of the Independent Institute for Educational Inquiry. I might add that it is out of that institute that he has created the project called the League of Small Democratic Schools that Woodring has been partnering with for the last 2 years, and you'll learn more about that project during the spring quarter events. John is an award-winning scholar and author who has authored over 30 books, published over 200 articles. Among the books is the highly acclaimed A Place Called Schools that received the Outstanding Book of the Year award from the American Educational Research Association and the Distinguished Book of the Year award from Kappa Delta Pi. He is also the author of the acclaimed Teachers for Our Nation's Schools that received the Outstanding Writing Award from the American Association of Colleges for Teacher Education. John Goodlad has received numerous national awards in recognition of his work, including the prestigious Harold McGraw Prize in Education, the James Bryan Conant Award for Outstanding Service to Education from the Education Commission of the States, the first Brock International Prize in Education, the New York Academy of Public Education Medal. I have a whole list of these things. I think what we'll do is we'll put all of this on our website along with the bibliography of books that society. In 2004, he published the book, Education for Everyone, a Mantle Bromley and Stephen Goodlad. It is that agenda and that vision that John Goodlad leaves as a legacy to all of us. The conversations that he has started is the conversation that we hope to continue to engage our students in at both the CEP and the Woodring College of Education and in our Journal of Educational Controversy. Please join me in welcoming John Goodlad.
Thank you very much. Whoops. I shouldn't touch anything electronic. I want to congratulate you because I've been here about 10 or 15 minutes, and I was delighted when the room was half full that we were all spread out all over the place. Usually it's all the back rows that are filled up first, nicely distributed. It's my pleasure to be here tonight, and I'm going to begin by saying a few things about Bellingham, this institution, and Paul Woodring, things that I don't think anybody in this room knows. I have some connections that go back a long way. I'll just summarize a few of them. Just over 61 years ago, my wife and I spent the first night of our honeymoon in the local hotel, which I think in those days was called the Olympic. Could that be possible? That's what sticks in my mind. It was the only major hotel in town. It may have been the only one, I'm not quite sure. Then later on, other activities, and one that I think now enough time has passed that I can recount it. You may not be aware, some of you, that this institution went through quite a struggle about 40 years ago, over a period of time, about what kind of institution it ought to be. And at that time, I'm not sure whether Fairhaven had been created or not, but certainly it was under discussion. And the board of this institution some members of it got the idea that this should be the Oxford of the West. And by that they meant Oxford University of the West. Well, I've seen those sorts of things emerge before. And it was, I'm sure, a lot of controversy within the Board of Regents or Board of Directors or whatever they're called here. And I became part of the decision-making process, or should I say the victim of it. Might be closer. I was then a professor, a relatively young professor at the University of Chicago, and I received a telephone call from the president of the board, and he said, "We'd like to talk with you about the presidency of our institution." And I didn't realize that I was sort of being set up, I think, interestingly enough, because the struggle here was, do we want to be an Oxford of the West, or do we want to be the kind of institution we've been and just do it better? And so they were looking for a president, and I didn't know who the others were that they called, but I do know there were two of us who apparently split this decision right down the middle. One of them was the president of the Great Books Foundation. And clearly he would be the person, if they're going to go, to be the Oxford of the West. I was heavily identified with teacher education, schooling, and so on, and I represented more what Western had been and might continue to be in the future. Well, the rest of the story you know. I don't think I would have accepted the position had I got it, because I argued against coming at all. And I said, I'm not really interested in being president of an institution, but I'm very much flattered. But I realized then that it was part of a struggle going on as to the kind of institution that this could be. Well, the Oxford of the West won for a while. I'm glad to say now a proper identification of that has been done. You have Fairhaven, which gets close to being a small Oxford of the West. And at the same time, the institution has deepened and strengthened the roots it had then, and really is a very exciting place. And those of you who are here, I hope you know how lucky you are to live here in this glorious part of the world, if you will, live in this lovely town, and to be part of this institution. I got to know Paul Woodring in a number of different kinds of settings, the most memorable of which was being stranded for 4 days in Puerto Rico. The University of Puerto Rico had just had completed a beautiful new building, and they were having a conference in honor of this new building, and several of us were invited for the week celebration. And I was the last on the list, and I'd been preceded by Frank Keppel. He was then Dean of the Graduate School of Education at Harvard. He was a sculptor who had been sort of drafted into the job against his will. And Paul Woodring followed him. Paul Woodring was at that time a professor here on the campus, and I was the third in row. We were all getting ready to return to the mainland on the following day when United Airlines went on strike. And there were small providers of airplanes, but everybody was heading for them. They were all filled. And they said, we were told that we'll let you know when there's a plane to get you out. Well, what will we do? Well, it was decided we'd do as much of a tour of Puerto Rico as we could, and certainly going up into the rainforest and so on. Well, when we went to rent a car, there was only one available. It was a manual shift VW Bug. There were 4 of us. The Bug is an amazingly roomy little creature. However, Well, it turned out that I was the only one who had ever driven a manual car to begin with, and I'd happened to drive a Bug, so I was elected to drive. Frank Keppel couldn't drive. He never did. When he would leave Harvard to go on a trip of some sort, his secretary would hand him a packet of money, and that he would taxi in, etc., but he never did drive. He never did rent a car. He never learned to drive, interestingly enough. And then there were Paul Woodring, who sat beside me as to give us direction to where we would go, and Frank said he would sit in the back seat and enjoy the company of Mrs. Woodring. I don't know how many of you knew Paul Woodring, but he was one of the best punsters I ever heard. He was incredible. Only he almost met his match in Frank Keppel. And so our trips up and down the mountainsides and so on were punctuated by these two exchanging puns. I might say, incidentally, I don't advise driving on some of those roads in Puerto Rico. They're great canyons where every car coming toward you tends to stay in the middle of the road. And it makes it a little tricky when you're trying to get around them. But anyway, there was a wonderful cartoon in the paper in Puerto Rico, and it showed a fellow in bathing shorts running down the beach, carrying a suitcase, and with a big sign, a placard, in the other hand saying, "Next stop, Miami," as though he were going to swim the whole distance. Well, as I said, with all of these back connections, there's one more connection that comes to mind, and that is, I don't know if there's anyone in this room that's read my book, Teachers for Our Nation's Schools, but the final chapter of that book is, in part, about this institution. I don't name it. I call it Northern University. But in writing about renewal and renewal in teacher education, I put together two universities, this one and San Francisco State. I put San Francisco State in there because of the extraordinary diversity of that institution, and particularly the folks from the southern part of our country, of our North America, and from South America in particular, and that kind of diversity was not here at that particular time. This was some years ago. And so those of you who get around to reading that book, if you do, you'll know the last chapter combines this institution and another in regard to change. Well, enough of that. That isn't what you came here for, but I can't help reminiscing at least a bit about my former connections here. I'm not going to entertain you. I think from this introduction you realize that the topic that Woodring College has chosen to take on is incredibly important. We're not in a situation in this country of having enemy coming in over the walls. I think 9/11 taught us something else that was different. And 9/11 was frightening in another way in that after 9/11 we were willing, it seemed, to give up many of our liberties. Wendell Berry, who I've read almost everything he's written, I think, he's incredible writing. I enjoy it immensely. And Wendell Berry wrote a little book, a little pamphlet, about 50-some-odd pages, called In the Face of Fear. And it was read all around the world, millions of copies. And what he was doing was expressing his great fear that under fear, we would be willing to give up our liberties in order to be safe. Nothing could be more dangerous to any nation. It's interesting to look at our democracy in relation to the Athenian democracy. And the one thing that they taught us was the importance of freedom. And I've been reading a series of volumes, perhaps some of you are familiar, they're fiction. Alan First lived nearby for a period of time. He's English. And he's written about 8 books now about the period in Europe between 1937-38 to about 42-43 and what went on in Europe during those days. And if you think the loss of liberty is not dangerous, read Alan First's book. Read what happened to Poland. Read what happened to Paris and France after they foolishly gave in early in World War II, in large measure, I suppose, because they didn't want the lovely city of Paris hurt. As it turned out, the Parisians suffered badly over that because they had no privileges. They were, in effect, prisoners within their own land. If you read novels, and it's documented and documented, there are pages and pages of documentation in the past. If you read Allen first, you realize the most dangerous thing that can happen to us is a loss of freedom. When we think about democracy, we're inclined to think about voting, and of course that's very important, and we've got an important election coming up soon. But in our work, we emphasize social democracy as well as political democracy. And by social democracy, I mean how we are with one another, how we treat one another, how we respect one another. And that means families, neighbors, unknowns, strangers, everyone. There's only one people in this world, only one mankind, made beautiful by all the colors that are represented in that one people. But there is only one people. And I'm aghast that so many of our social studies texts talk about other people. I don't know any other people. There's just one people in the world. Well, I say that as a kind of introduction to say why I'm not going to try to entertain you. On the political side, it might be interesting that in the last federal election, there was a poll taken that I happened to encounter, taken right after that election. I can't remember the figures exactly, but for some reason or other, 30% sticks in my head. And that is, on the day before that election, close to 30% of the people who would vote still didn't know who they would vote for. Now that shows an extraordinary lack of understanding of the issues and problems of our nation, if that would be the case. Now the issues I want to talk about are timeless, and therefore I have to try to make my remarks timely. To try to make them so, I've bundled together 4 related themes, each of which has been relevant during the entire 67 years that I've been in this business as a professional educator. The first theme is about what education is. The second addresses schooling in our democracy as a moral endeavor. The third charges schools, both public and private, with the risk-laden responsibility of being the primary agents for cultivating a democratic society. The fourth has to do with the stagnation of school reform and how we might move, and then beyond that, how we now might move into a state of continuously renewing our educational institutions and their democratic context. We're not to be engaged in projects. We've had enough projects. What we need is a continuous process of renewing, the kind of thing that so many people try to do with their bodies and their minds, we must do as a nation. The children in this country go to school 180 days a year, virtually nationwide. Half the days of the year. They sleep about 8 hours. They go to school on the average, or in education schooling activities overall, between the age of 5 and 18, 6 to 8 hours. And they spend the remaining 8 to 10 hours with friends, with family, with communications of various kinds, great deal of time on cell phones. Of those, then, schooling is the lesser, in terms of time, educational agency of them all. And yet we expect our schools to be doing the education for everyone. And when we aren't doing well as a nation, we blame our schools for not educating us properly, when in effect it is, in nature of time, it is the lesser institution. How many times do we have to dig up the data in regarding the fact that if you look at test scores, and at the top test scores, there are very, very few students in those top test scores who have been in a deprived home, a deprived neighborhood, indeed a deprived lifestyle. Things weren't always this way. Better teachers with well-developed curricula and ample materials and resources would turn our society around. The children would grow up to eliminate poverty in this country, eliminate homelessness, eliminate violence and unemployment, and ultimately ensure world peace. I attended a conference in the summer after that act had been passed in early 1965, a conference of business people, educators, and so on in Washington, D.C., and heard speeches that would lift you off your seat almost. And I was so charged by that conference that I thought I could get back to Los Angeles without the need for an airplane. A year after this stunning announcement to the American people, which the American people didn't quite grasp it, it was so stunning, their schools were going to do this. Either they didn't quite grasp it or they thought their schools couldn't do it, and they weren't far off from that point of view. Just 1 year later, after this stunning act, so different from the most recent Elementary and Secondary Act, which had produced No Child Left Behind. A year later, the President was stunned by the report of sociologist James Coleman, a study that had been commissioned by the federal government and was expected to show that if you pour these resources into the schools, we will be able to close the achievement gap. Have you ever heard those words before? Coleman's much debated critical finding stunned the President and stunned in many ways many people and many educators. Coleman concluded that school performance correlates more closely with the social capital pupils bring from their homes to the classroom and encounter from other homes in the classroom than does the curriculum, do great rich materials, and do teachers. A terrible downer for teachers to learn, to hear the Coleman report. It was a stunning report in another way, and that is that if indeed the achievement of youngsters is more dependent on the social capital that the young bring to the classroom from home and their communities, and that's greater than the impact of teachers and curricula and so on, then surely we don't want to integrate schools when we're going to get more youngsters coming from low social capital homes into the classroom. And so the integration paper has urged our leaders to quit demanding that the school percent of high school students. So time after time we have these papers that tell us that schools can't bring about this turnaround. They can be part of it, but they can't affect it. And yet we're hearing over and over from our political leaders that the schools were responsible for our dropping off of the global economy 15, 20 years ago. And then, lo and behold, the economy turned around, and you didn't hear a word about the wonderful job that the schools had done. Many of our business leaders and nearly all of our policymakers seem to believe that schools with high test scores are our best schools and are the ones most likely to cultivate the well-being of our people and the health of our nation. Perhaps we need a little boy to speak the truth to them. the little boy in the fable of the emperor's new clothes. Academic test scores do not correlate with any virtue you want to name. Not honesty, not compassion, not civility, not civicness, not good work habits, not dependability, not perseverance, and certainly not wisdom. Ultimately, unfortunately, most people think that the school they know and perhaps send their children to is bringing up their children in the attributes they value. They are being taught by the rhetoric of school reform that rising test scores provide the supporting evidence that the schools are providing what the people want. But there is now a widening chasm between what patrons expect of the public school and what the schooling enterprise provides. A couple of major studies conducted 15 years ago or 20 years ago, and various polls since then, show that parents come close to what education means in their expectations for the public school, much closer than do our political and business leaders. They want the wholeness of education, an integrative combining of personal, social, vocational, and academic intellectual development of the young. They want the works. They don't want youngsters just able to pass scores, but they're confused. And I'll come to how we might get around this confusion in due course of time. Well, I said that my first theme was, what is education anyway? Dictionaries are sometimes a pretty good place to look for answers to some of what words mean. And Webster's Third says some interesting things about education and about educating. I was surprised that in Webster's and in the Oxford, long paragraphs about education. And education, the Webster says, is the growing up or development of a person by fostering the extension of knowledge, qualities of mind, and character and wisdom. Good education provides a sense of community, personal identity, inner strength, purpose, meaning of life, and belonging. These are major attributes. These are the attributes that parents expect the schools to produce. Unfortunately, developing these attributes of becoming human, which is what they are, is not easily measured and is often regarded as soft and tender, especially too soft and tender for the males of our culture. Failure to keep before us a clear understanding of what education is has resulted in our elementary, secondary, and higher institutions of learning becoming more and more training centers. I had occasion to have to go back and read most of one of my own books. It's called What Schools Are For. And a new edition has come out, and I was asked to write an afterword. The book was published in 1979, and so I had to go back and look at what I said there to see if I still believed it. And I revisited some people who I quoted back then in regard to sharing the belief I have of what education is, and one of them was philosopher John Dewey. Another one was philosopher Alfred North Whitehead. Another one was English philosopher R.S. Peters. And I find that I quoted them back in that book, and I looked again and pulled out some very short sentences that are very powerful in regard to what education is. Says Dewey, education is all one with growing. It has no end in itself. A seminar might ponder that for a long time. It has no end in itself. And then I cite Peters, who viewed training, not educating, as the appropriate word when we have a specific extrinsic objective in mind. When we say that education is to prepare the young for work, we're really talking about training. We're not talking about education. And then I refer to Whitehead's elaboration of education having no separation of ends and means. It's all one. One could argue about, as I hope you will, those sorts of definitions of what education is because there's so little of that around these days. Let the economic marketplace do all the training it needs for its well-being. But let's be sure that educational institutions concentrate on helping each person to make as much of himself or herself as possible, while becoming a responsible contributor to the well-being of humankind and our habitat. School has major educational responsibilities. They shouldn't have very much responsibility for training. That can come later. My second theme is schooling as a moral endeavor. We talk a lot about education as a moral endeavor, but not much about schooling as a moral endeavor. The popular conception of education is that education is a good thing. Actually, education is neutral. It's neither good nor bad. We have to put the good into it. It can be bad. As I recall, Dickens wrote a book, and there was a movie made of it in which he showed a vile man educating youngsters in all kinds of negative behaviors and training them in thievery. Those of you who remember that bit of Dickens will recall that there was also education in it, what kind of beliefs we have about one another, and it was bad. Education is a value-neutral concept. Those of us in this room who are educators have to put the good into education. It isn't there already. And the education one acquires can be moral, immoral, or usually some of both. This creates troublesome problems for schools. Most parents say, or not most parents, but some parents say, I want my child's school to teach reading, writing, and mathematics, and stay away from morals. This short statement creates a couple of quandaries for educators, because how do you go about teaching without teaching moral values? I don't know how anyone can do that. So for parents to expect parents to do that is to sort of neuterize teachers. They're not to have any values, apparently. It is impossible for schools to educate and be morally neutral. And then, if you go back to my sentence, teach reading, writing, and mathematics and stay away from morals. Morals and moral aren't the same thing. They're not interchangeable words. If I were to divide this audience up into small groups and then charge you to determine the moral core of education for the nation's schools, you'd all come up with a great deal of agreement, and you'd come up with it very quickly. I'd give you half an hour and you'd do a wonderful job. Why? You would answer the question of whose values, by agreeing that we wish to articulate our values, those that bind us together as a moral ecology. I doubt that any of you would come up with an alternative perspective, one that would not endorse for everyone a reasonably safe, healthy, and productive life. I don't think any of my groups, if I did that, would suggest that schools need not seek to sustain our democracy, and we wouldn't argue that some other agency or institution is better equipped to do it. Nor would they argue that it would be inappropriate for schools to develop in their students qualities of judgment, strength of character, and self-understanding. I think most of us are quite aware of what democracy expects of us, and we of it, and don't have much trouble coming up with liberty, equity, and justice for all. But the difference between what we would come up with and what is enormous. My third theme is the making of a democratic public. Almost everyone growing up in the United States attends a school. That's what makes it so important. Nearly everybody goes, whether it's public or private, they go to school. No other institutions comes close to schools in embracing everyone, nor does any other educate so comprehensively. No other comes close to schools in the risk-laden nature of its mission, educating everyone's children. A large part of the risk for schools and their teachers is the lack of a clearly articulated public democratic purpose. I had a meeting with some number of people in this room this afternoon for a period of time, and I said that when they were talking about school-university partnerships, and I said the most important thing that a university can do in working with schools is to help schools find their public purpose. Polls show considerable muted agreement among parents and others regarding their general expectations for schools. There's high-level agreement. But when principals and parents come to the school, they don't talk about the big things. They want to know how Jeannie and Tommy are doing. They don't talk about the big issues of schooling at all. As a result, as our research shows very clearly, most teachers and principals don't think that the public agrees on what our schools are for at all. When we were doing studies and I would walk down the hallways with a principal or vice principal and say, do you have some public overall purpose for the school? And they'd look at me rather strangely and say, no, because the public has no purpose for schooling. And this struck me as being very strange. Actually, if you take polls and you give them words like, do you want personal development? Yes. Do you want social development? Yes. Do you want economic development? Yes. Do you want intellectual development? Yes. They want it all. An ironic paradox emerges out of contemplating schooling as a rhetorical abstraction and messing around in its realities, because its realities can be rather messy. On one hand, most educators and most parents share a common perspective regarding what our schools are for. That is, the education of the young and what it means to be a good human being, a good citizen, in the universal sense of those words. On the other, there are the regularities of schooling, the daily routines of creating a learning environment out of a too small, sterile one. Even getting mentally from thinking about what education is and what schools are for, and then being able to translate into this reality is an extraordinarily difficult thing to do. But that's what good schools do. Show me a good school, and it'll be a school with deep-seated beliefs, moral beliefs, that has learned how to implement those beliefs in the classrooms and in the other activities of schools. Good schools meet the challenge of translating these abstractions into the daily realities. Good schools, as I'm defining them, achieve much more than educating the young. In political scientist Benjamin Barber's words, they turn a host of everyone's into something like a single national one with a capital O. The civic entity we call a public. This is the responsibility not only of elementary and secondary schools, but also of tertiary schools or higher institutions as well. I haven't had much time to read lately, and a colleague brought me a book that I'm just beginning to get into, and I'm looking forward to get into. It's written by a man named Harry Lewis. He was, for quite a few years, the dean of Harvard College. Now, Harvard College is the soul of morality of Harvard University. The graduate schools are all professional schools, engaged in a great deal of training. But where education, real education, is supposed to take place is in the college. That, again, coming back to Fairhaven, that is something that would be talked about a great deal in that part of this institution, I would think. Well, his book has an interesting title, Excellence Without a Soul. And soul is spelled S-O-U-L. And it provides a detailed history, documented, the ins and outs of it, which are available to anyone who wants to look them up, into how, in his judgment, Harvard's mission evolved from education to consumer satisfaction. This is quite an indictment from Lewis, who was dean of the college at Harvard for quite a number of years. I imagine that the Board of Governors of Harvard University is very happy with this professor. Lewis makes clear that Harvard does not stand alone in this evolution and argues for sweeping change. And I'm reminded of Neil Postman's book, The End of Education, published shortly before his death, in which he says that our schools are now driven by the God of economic utility. Well, I've given you a rather sobering critique, quite deliberately, because now we need to start talking about a new day. Many of us, and by us I mean the people of this nation, have longed for and even anticipated the new dawning of the school that once was looked up to as the source of our enlightenment and the bastion of our security. Part of the American dream. We must not beguile ourselves into thinking that it will magically emerge, this previous school, in a new day, that it'll just disappear when No Child Left Behind is left behind. Lately, I've been asking a lot of my colleagues around the country, will things change drastically if No Child Left Behind is left behind? And they all say, not very much. Not very much because our political and business leaders want a neat measure of schools, which they think indicates good schools. They don't know better. And so, even if there should be quite a turnaround in the upcoming election, and there should be a Democratic House and a Democratic Senate and a Democratic President, don't count on No Child Left Behind being left behind, or at least its successor. We have a very, very hard time getting away from the idea that we can have easy ways of measuring the goodness of our schools, and that the schools that perform and the schools that don't perform, they're all accountable. Now, don't think if we do have some major governmental changes that we'll quickly have the new dawning of a day where the school was at the heart of the American dream. The new day will come slowly. And in this country, we're not accustomed to doing social and political things slowly. We want the answers quickly. But we won't turn our schools around to the way we want them quickly. They will come slowly, over a relatively long period of time, during which much will be demanded of all of us, and teachers in those schools will become more important than ever. Marilyn Cochran Smith of Boston College was former president of the American Educational Research Association, and for 6 years she edited the Journal of Teacher Education. I had the responsibility for reading all of those 30 editorials she wrote over 6 years, and then writing an introduction around them for her book. In fact, they're all in a book now. And one of the themes that runs through about pretty nearly half of her editorials is educators have got to wake up and start being the educational leaders in their communities. The the policy arena and the business arenas have let us down. And they've let us down outrageously. And I can't think of any place else to turn but to educators. However, educators won't give us the new day we need without public support. And this is why the coming of the new day will take time, because we have to work now very hard at getting that public support and getting the public involved in the education conversation that has left the local community and gone to Washington, D.C., where it died. We've got to bring it back. Theodore Sizer, some of you have read his wonderful work. Ted Sizer was on target when he noted that the authors of the 1983 report, A Nation at Risk, perceived that the power of existing school practice was too strong for any new arrangements to succeed. Consequently, that report simply gave us old recommendations that went all the way back to the Conant report on the high school in 1957. There's nothing new in A Nation at Risk. And it's interesting that they feared that there was no political traction in coming up with something new, that the public would resist it. They may have been close to right at the time, but I don't think any longer. As Sizer put it, the sanctity of the symbols of school. We could list those symbols of schooling, recess time, 3:15, 3:30, out at the end of the day, the class structure, the grades, all of those regularities of schooling which haven't been touched in a long, long time. Some of us have batted our heads against trying to do it, and it's enormously different. And he said the sanctity of the symbols of school were deeply embedded in the ways the American middle class shaped their experience of schooling. After intensely studying the meandering course of schooling over the 20th century, David Tyack and Larry Cuman, in their aptly titled book, Tinkering Toward Utopia. I love that title, Tinkering Toward Utopia. It was a history, and historians don't try to give us answers. But they did conclude with they did come up with one major conclusion, and that is that the only hope for change they saw was that the local communities had to assume greater authority and responsibility for designing and sustaining an agenda of school purpose, policy, and practice. Here, on common ground, educators, parents, and others must come together in common cause. Our readiness for major changes in schooling has, I think, shifted significantly over the past couple of decades. I think we're ready for it. I think we're ready for innovation. We're ready for change. We're ready for bold change, just as soon as we do a little clearing up of some of the current restraints. Because with some of those out of the way, we can do better. The individual schools people know well, that is, the school that the parents know where children go, where their children go, and so on, those schools still get high marks. In the annual Gallup poll on schooling, published every September for over 30 years now, the local school where the children go gets mostly A-minuses and B-pluses. The schooling enterprise gets D's and F's. We have been carefully taught that we have a lousy school system. You and I and millions of other people are fed up with educational summits that don't represent the lay public or educators. We're becoming bored with commissioned reports that get news coverage for a while and then disappear. And we're becoming tired of the debate and collateral damage of No Child Left Behind. Increasing numbers among us are becoming aware that the infrastructure of our democracy is in critical need of renewal, and that our schools must play a more powerful role in that process by ensuring that they advance the democratic public purpose of education. And the public democratic purpose of education overshadows all private purpose. Many want to play a role in that process. They want to be involved. You in this room want to be involved. This process of simultaneously renewing our schools and our democracy must be quite different from that which has characterized school reform eras before. I've studied, in my book, Romances with Schools, published a couple of years ago, I document some of the reform eras and what was going on during those times and how great events in our society blocked change. The renewal we need will not propose an educational agenda. The process of change will be the agenda. Incidentally, to give you just a little hunch of how difficult this might be to get ourselves dealing with the public purpose of schooling, colleagues and I wrote a book that was mentioned in the introduction entitled Education for Everyone. But the title of that book was initially Agenda for Education in a Democracy. And the editor-in-chief of Josie Bass Publishing in San Francisco and I were on the telephone, and she said, "John, we need a title for your book. It's about to go to press and we don't have a title." I said, "We gave you a title, Agenda for Education in a Democracy." She said, "I took that title to my boss, because Josie Bass is owned by Wiley and Company, so she has to go upstairs to get approval for every book. And they said, no way. The word democracy in the title of a book turns off readers." Wow. We do have a problem, don't we? So the process will be the agenda. There will be no invitations from political leaders to board a train, and then we will talk. As former Secretary of Education Lamar Alexander asked us to do some years ago when he was Secretary of Education, when he came into cities like Seattle and then met with the mayor and others, very often not with the educators, but with the power structure of the district. He said, "Get on the train and we'll talk." I don't like getting on trains and not knowing where they're going. The schooling debate, such as it became, went to Washington, D.C. But Alexander's train has to come back to the nation's community where it belongs, where it will be rejuvenated, and from which guiding messages and even invitations to educational conferences will go to members of Congress and even to the President of the United States. If they don't want to attend, that's okay. Instead of educators occasionally being invited to summits, educators will invite the politicians to our educational meetings. You come? You don't want to come? Okay, that's too bad. We're going to carry on the debate. Now comes the neat part, the hard but challenging and exciting part for educators, parents, and interested members of our diverse communities and individual schools. I'm talking now about the schools you and I know, the ones parents send their children to, the ones we pay our taxes for, and the ones that we're concerned about because whether or not we have children, we have to live with everybody else's children. Early in my book, A Place Called School, I wrote that our schools must be renewed one by one. When I reread the book to write a new afterword, I found that I believe that even more strongly than I did before. Schools are too different, too varied to have a one-size-fits-all. Today, in our little meeting, I talked about the fact that I have a garden. And it's a garden that's 100 feet from salt water. That affects that garden mightily. It'll wipe out, when the cold mists of late winter come in, it'll wipe out half of a fruit tree. And so I have to figure out how to handle a garden that's 100 feet from salt water. Now, what would our gardens be like if in Olympia there was something comparable to No Child Left Behind, and we all had to follow the same straitjacket in our gardens. Very few would survive. The tough part of the challenge I'm talking is that individual schools are not accustomed to renewing themselves. We did a lot of research on this, and we visited school after school after school in our study that produced my book, A Place Called School. We worked with 18 schools in Southern California for 6 years, and we found that in those schools there was no process of ongoing renewal. They took care of the daily business. They even had so-called strategic plans, but those strategic plans were in people's drawers. They weren't being followed because they were too abstract and too lofty. And we didn't find principals who knew how to get a working consensus on their staff. If you're a principal and you think you're going to get 100% agreement, just forget it. The best you can do is get a working consensus, and at the end of a meeting you say, okay, we seem to be, most of us agreed on such and such. We'll revisit this at another time, but for now we're going to do so and so. And there's a process here. There's a process of conversation that must take place. Dialogue. Dialogue must be followed by decision making. There must be decisions. We educators love to talk and talk and talk about what we might do, but then we must make decisions. And then we must take action. And then we must evaluate the consequences of what we do. DDAE, dialogue, decisions, actions, and evaluation. This is an entirely different model of change than we've had. It's an ecological model. Schools, teacher preparing programs are ecological in character. They're not ends and means. They're not inputs, outputs. There are complex ecological activities going on, the making of the culture of a school, the making of the culture of a teacher education program that needs constant attention just as a garden needs constant attention. It's the model that guides our work in our National Network for Educational Renewal. The National Network is an organization of more than 20 settings, 24, I think, 25, and growing in 20 states that are committed to an agenda for education and a democracy. These are universities connected with schools. Over 40 universities connected to a couple of hundred school districts, connected to, in overall, several thousand schools. And they're guided by an agenda, a moral agenda, where people ask questions, is this the right thing to do? Is this the moral thing to do? And they meet annually in a conference and exchange the progress they're making. Talk about the innovations they're trying to get into. This ecological model is one that social psychologist Seymour Saracen wrote about for years. He still is writing about it as he, I think, gets to 90 years of age. And it's the one that Michael Fullen, you've encountered his work, some of you, Andy Hargreaves and others have described the kind of leadership we need in order to have this ecological model work. And it is the model, as I said, that guides our national network, and I hope it will be the model that guides more and more school-university partnerships as time progresses. The domain that educators have been slow to enter is that of engaging in this dialogue and ultimately in the full cycle of decisions, action, and evaluation with the people whose taxes support the school district. Several of my colleagues have just come through a 3-year initiative funded by the Kellogg Foundation designed to forge a partnership of school and university personnel with people from the community, with the goal of strengthening the schooling of youth in a risk situation and environment. The reports that have come out of these settings encourage me to believe that it is possible to have constructive conversation, action, decisions among educators and the lay public. And indeed, if we don't succeed in achieving that, we aren't going to make much change in our schools. Strangely, in our research, we found out that while the best friends schools have are the parents who send their children there, the relationship between parents and teachers is rather aloof. I've spent much of my time here critiquing what I believe to be a dead-end road to achieving schools that will serve well the democratic public purpose for which they are intended. I've only roughly and minimally provided a sketch of the difficult road we must now take. Its chief attraction is the participatory role it offers educators and the people who care about and invest in our schools. The core of my message is that every school and every town and every hamlet in our nation must begin and sustain a conversation about the kinds of topics I've been discussing tonight. It's not an easy conversation. That conversation in schools and around them must lead to actions guided by increasing understanding of what our schools are for and how they become good at what they're for. I say good because it's a moral word. I deliberately didn't say excellent because it's not a moral word. The process must become ubiquitous, like the air around us, becoming in time a permanent part of our culture. This nasty concept of school reform will fade, I trust, into antiquity, and our grandchildren will wonder why its demise was so long in coming. Thank you. I understand we have time for that conversation I talked about. So we may have to have a relay. I don't see, there isn't a microphone being passed around among the group, is there? Sure. Oh, we do. Okay. Are they're coming up from down below?
Yeah, there should be
okay.
3x5 cards
Great.
that will be collected by people, and we have a couple right here to get
Okay,
started with.
good.
Okay. So the first question is, do schools really have choice in our society? Choice in curriculum, standardized testing, goals, etc.?
Can you do that again?
Do schools really have choice in our society, as in choice in standardized testing or curriculum or goals?
Oh, sure. Oh, you bet. We've got choice all the time. We've just been making the wrong choices. The business is what should that process be like in order to be making those choices? And it's awfully tough being a politician. And when you realize, if you just look at our own state, and you realize that the legislature has got to consider problems of transportation, problems of airports, problems of health and disease, problems of education, how in the world can they be qualified to give the answers, good answers to these kinds of questions, if they don't turn to people who know something about it? And it is very strange. You would not think of having a medical conference without having doctors there. We don't hesitate to have educational conferences without having educators there. When the governors met at their last summit or whatever they called it, they invited a few educators who they knew would be politically aligned with what they were going to talk about. But they didn't invite any of the people I know. They certainly didn't invite me. And so in a sense, yes, the cards are stacked. And that's why this democracy becomes so important. We've got to pay more attention to these politicians and ask them rough questions when they come to speak. And of course, how many of us attend those meetings when they come to speak? There's a man back in Ohio named George Wood, and he's now the director of a new organization that I'm one of the founders of it, called Forum for Education and Democracy. And George is busy trying to build a forum around the concept of education democracy, very much as we are, although this forum is more addressing the political side of things, and we're trying to address the programmatic parts of things. And George, in his local community, discovered that somebody from the Department of Education in Washington was coming to town to speak about No Child Left Behind, so he went. George went to his speech. And it turned out that the man had to catch a plane, and he left, and the crowd was still there. They were so excited and so interested they were still there, but their speaker had gone. But before he left, George began to ask him some tough questions. And the crowd began to get wise. And they began to realize there was another side to what they'd heard. And they got more and more interested, and that's why they didn't leave when the speaker left. And pretty soon they had George giving the other side of the picture. Well, that was an accident, but I think we're going to have to pay a lot more attention. So the answer to your question is yes, of course, but we aren't doing it very well.
Thank you. Is there a way to make use of the WASL? Can WASL testing and holistic education coexist?
Is there a way to make it what?
To make use of the WASL, and can WASL testing and holistic education coexist?
Not in its present form. We're always going to have tests. Look, I've been in this business 67 years, and there have been tests all that period of time. We're always going to have tests. And tests can be kind of fun. But boy, these aren't any fun for kids. The problem, WASL's better than most. I mean, it's a lot better than most. Some states are now in the process of saying they'll forego the federal money, which is about 7% of the budget of most school districts. And they'll forego the money because they're having to give up too much in order to do it. In fact, Vermont backed off because it was going to cost them more to implement the tests than they'd get from the government. I was back in December, January, somewhere back in there. I addressed the Utah school boards in Salt Lake City. And Utah, interesting to be at Utah, they're raising a lot of questions about continuing with the No Child Left Behind problem. And you know, it's one of the poorest states. I think they don't rank right at the bottom. They're very close to it. Yet they do an amazing job with one of the lowest cost per student in the country. And people are beginning to wake up a little bit. Do we want good test takers, or do we want people who are compassionate, honest, decent, and etc.? And I think the answer to that is pretty clear. I don't see any problem at all with tests. I had to give tests. The trouble is the teachers don't get the feedback. You know, teachers do not get the kind of stuff that I got when I gave tests. When I gave tests that were required, I was born in Canada, and the tests were provided by the Ministry of Education in Victoria, and I gave these tests. But I gave them, and I bundled them up and sent them off, and I looked at all of them, and I got all the feedback. Now, I don't think we trust teachers anymore. I was trusted that I would use this feedback because the accountability built in was not frightening, and it was understood that I would use this information to deal with the class. The amazing thing I've discovered in my own research is that teachers know their children and whether they're doing well or not. Even teachers who wouldn't be judged the best teachers, the average teacher, they know their children better than anyone else. They know. The other thing that's wrong is that we're emphasizing only part of an academic, entirely academic, and we're testing only part of the curriculum, which means we're only giving part of the curriculum. The arts have practically disappeared. Recess has disappeared some places. It's kind of ironic, isn't it, that one of the nation's big problems right now is the obesity of the young. But we don't give them recess or physical education. Such contradictions. I can't understand, frankly, I can't understand how we're so stupid. I think the biggest indictment of our school system is the people who we produced who are running the show. Yeah. Does that answer the question?
Thank you. In the context of the witch hunt against radical professors, led by David Horowitz. How do we break down the dichotomy of liberal and conservative and encourage teachers to be active citizens without being labeled?
Oh, boy. That's about as tough as you can get. You know, we're always going to have the liberals and the conservatives. And the idea, of course, in the party system was that they would balance one another off and they would prevent one group from being in charge forever and so on. I think what we've got, I don't have a good answer. I might as well be honest. I don't have a good answer for the question. I just know it's always going to be around. But I think if we could get our eyes on the problems we have to solve instead of sticking to ideology, we might be able to do something about this situation. In other words, we know, it stares out at us. We know we do not live up to the standards of our democracy when we've got this huge underbelly in regard to the incomes, the jobs, and all of this underserved group. And that underbelly is worldwide. It's not just the United States problem, it's worldwide. And but we, in terms of reputation, with most people, are the leading democracy in the world. However, tests are now showing that if you take criteria for democracy and what they mean, we rank about 14th among the nations of the world, and you'd be surprised at some of the nations that are ranked ahead of us. And so we're not paying attention to the problems that we have. Schools are not able to do what a lot of people want them to do. When Nation at Risk started that report by a sentence that said something like, if another nation had imposed our educational system upon us, we would have considered it an act of war. Well, that sort of caught the attention of the American people. But the ideology that came in was that our schools are responsible for our global economy. Any first-rate economist will tell you that's absolute bunk. I think one of the second most important thing to a democratic public is to develop crap detectors. We've got to be alert to the stuff that gets dumped on us that is only part of the information and doesn't give us the rest of it. And I mentioned and didn't develop the point that a Nation at Risk said it was the schools that had caused our near collapse in the world economy. And then when our economy zoomed back, there wasn't a mention of it in the press anywhere. And furthermore, the kids who had been going to school weren't graduated in that work anyway yet. And that sort of thing bounces around. So, yeah, we're always going to have this break. And the challenge to democracy is to make it work. And it has gone so much the party you belong with. Lyndon B. Johnson had a Republican as Secretary of Education for a period of time, John Gardner. That wonderful man, he wrote a book. He was Speaker of the House, and he was from Massachusetts, blocking on his name. Wonderful. Every time he went home, he met with the people, with them, and so on. And he was a Democrat during the Reagan administration. And usually at the end of the day, if President Reagan was there, he and President Reagan would have a drink together. You know, it's happening now. We're all citizens of this country, and we need to be. I don't understand this somehow. I'm an immigrant. I'm not a Native American. Yet here I am up here talking about these sorts of things. What's your next question?
Hi, do you want some water? You doing okay? Do you want some water or anything? Water?
Yeah, that's a good idea. Okay, go ahead. What's your next?
You mentioned that there are some old restraints that need to be cleared before bold change can take place. What are they? How do we get them out of the way? These old
What were your
restraints.
first few words? I didn't quite catch them.
You mentioned that there are some old restraints that need to be cleared before bold change can take place. What are they? How do we
I did mention some of them. We've got to we can reform education by having a commission report. We look around the country and select some of the leading figures in politics and government, and they do a report, and that's going to change things. That you got to quit doing that. It's not going to get anywhere. It's just going to waste money. These education summits where governors are going to go back home and be between education governors growing out of Senate, no. That governor is going to come into the office understanding the importance of education in a democracy because he schools that prepared him to understand democracy. And so when he becomes a governor or a senator or whatever, he understands the importance of observing this democracy. There's never been a successful democracy, and we're never going to have a perfect one. It's always going to have potholes. You can't expect something built on education for the people, by the people, and of the people. You can't expect that not to have lumps and bumps. Because if we are indeed going to give equity to everybody, that really means equality. Our people who are connected with our work have been reading a little book called First Democracy. And it's the story of the Athenian democracy. And we get this held up to us as a model democracy, but it wasn't. So and there are just a lot of ideas that need to be straightened out because we're not getting the full story in so many areas. Why isn't there a lot more discussion about democracy, for example, so that we realize that when the Iraqi people get the vote, which is very, very important, they still don't necessarily have a democracy. And we kid ourselves into thinking, okay, they're going to vote, therefore they have democracy. No way. We've got the right to vote and had it for some time, and even women got the right to vote. The right to vote, representative government, and so on, they all have their problems. Indeed, the author of the first democracy, Paul Woodruff, who's an ethics professor at the University of Texas, he simply is straight out there with the fact we've got to forget priding ourselves because we have a vote, we have representative government, and so on. And he points out the weaknesses of these. Interestingly enough, he puts forward 7 basic principles which for him are democracy. And there's a very fascinating one that caught my attention. And it's making decisions without information. Because that's what most of it is. When I've given that business of nearly 30% of the people not knowing who vote for on the next day, they were making decisions without information. But on the other hand, most decisions are without information. We talk about teachers making decisions based on evidence. Teachers make 1,000 decisions a day. They're going to make all those decisions because they know the research on every decision they're going to make. That's a lot of poppycock. Rather, teachers make decisions out of their beliefs. They can never survive without that. So, well, enough said. Give me your next question.
Okay. In light of that, what are the differences between teaching to create a democracy and teaching to create a just society?
Teaching to create a just society.
That's what the card says.
Teaching to create a democracy and teaching to create a just society? Well, just society is part of being a democracy, so just society is an element of the democratic process, and a very important one. And suppose for our society right now, you'd have to put getting a just society right near the top with the equity factor built into it. But presumably a democracy is a just society. It's interesting in the Athenian democracy, Athens had tried, just like we're doing. They tried to impose democracy on all the surrounding city-states like Sparta and so on. So they'd go to war. It's kind of familiar, isn't it? They'd go to war in order to defeat these people and teach them about their democracy, and then they made all the defeated people became slaves and didn't get a vote. So I was told one time if you go to a party and you're short of language to use and meeting strangers, one of the things you can say, it's all relevant. It's all relevant. It'll carry you around a conversation for quite a while. It's all relevant. And I think with a democracy, it's always going to be, it's all relevant. That is, we will have some things that are functioning and some that aren't functioning too well. And we got to just go on working and renewing. If I use my garden analogy, you're learning all the time and things are going wrong. I've had a terrible time with several young plum trees that produce a plum and then it wizzens up and dies. Well, I find out my trees need more blood meal and bone meal. That's renewing. And so we have to keep on finding out where things are going and then repair them according to getting them in line with our value system.
Thank you.
What else do you have for me?
Well, let's see here. How do you feel about the current debate of having all male or all female schools?
I don't know why this one has crept up all of a sudden, but the papers, the Seattle PI has had a long story about it the other day, and you heard it, the all male or all female. I was a colleague of Bruno Bettelheim at the University of Chicago, and I first ran into this a long time ago, and Bruno favored, with the onset of pubescence, he favored separating boys and girls because when pubescence sets in, you can't teach kids anything if you got a mixed group. There's certain truth to what he's saying, I guess, but again, we've got to come back. We've got to learn to live with everybody, and girls have to learn to live with boys, and boys have to learn with girls as part of our society. It's interesting that girls growing up have always enjoyed situations that were all girls, and boys have enjoyed situations that were all boys. That's why we had Girl Scouts and Boy Scouts. And so I guess my question is, viva these activities in which they're all girls and all boys, but I'd be reluctant to do this with our schools. The tragedy here is that at a period of time, there were a lot of all the schools in the South, in particularly the high school level. There are quite a number of them. And why didn't we do some research on it? Here we are. This is a very important decision where I'm unwilling to go just by values because I can't find any values to support and negate it. And so what we need are some data. What is really going on with these kids during one way or the other way? And we have the the kind of research design that researchers just are ecstatic over. It would have been very easy to have an experimental group and a control group without having to arrange anything. You just go out and select a group of all school high schools or on all boy high schools, and then take the ones that were mixed, there were plenty of those. You've got a ready set. But the practice disappeared before we got any research, and now it's difficult to do it because there aren't that many. We probably ought to let it run and do a lot of research on it. If we just do it and don't find out anything about it again, we've wasted our time. But I certainly would not want this to be all the way through until it's time to vote. I would hope that there'd be a lot more interaction for that. There's another aspect of this. We do have, I think there's no question about it, we do have a female culture and we do have a male culture, and that becomes apparent very, very early. We give little girls certain toys, we give little boys male toys. Kind of nonsense, but that's what we do. And I would think that it would be possible to get some data some data on this. The fact that we have this combined culture makes me want to make it work rather than give it up. So I think I lean toward not favoring it, but I'd have a hard time with this one. A few things I don't have my ecology of belief adequately established as yet. What else?
Okay. How do you teach children to be advocates of social justice without impressing your beliefs upon them?
What was the word? Imposing or impressing?
Impressing. Sorry.
Impressing?
Impressing your beliefs upon them.
Imposing?
Maybe it's, yeah. I don't,
Imposing? Imposing beliefs upon them. Well, imposing beliefs on people isn't education. We're not in the non-education business. You don't impose beliefs on anyone. Of course, all of us experienced that when we were growing up. Our parents imposed beliefs on us every day, just in the air. You don't do this, and you do something else. And this is one of the reasons. I would have preferred the question a little while ago to be homeschooling versus schooling rather than separate sexes, because it is so very, very important to have experience with a whole array of beliefs. When parents say, for example, I don't want my kids taught anybody else's morals. The thing is that youngsters, as they grow up and mature, have to experience a wide range of different viewpoints in order to form their basic kinds of beliefs. So imposing, however, coming back to the question itself, imposing, however, is just not part of education, and so we don't impose beliefs on anybody if we can help it. One of the best mentors I ever had, and I've had quite a few good ones, was a man named Ralph Tyler. Some of you are familiar with his work, who I think was one of the top 3 or 4 educators of the second half of the 20th century. He handled most of our problems, most of these value questions he handled by asking you questions. And the phenomenal thing with this man was, you'd go to him, I was one of his doctoral students, and I'd go to him and he wouldn't do anything I ought to do. He'd just ask me questions, and I only got 10 minutes. He saw us, he was very busy, he was held a whole lot of positions at the University of Chicago, and he saw 6 of his graduate students a week for 10 minutes each. That's what you got. And I would come in, and he would only ask me questions. And when I walked out the door, I knew what I was going to do. And he just asked questions. The amazing thing is, when you have an advisor like that, you prepare for the conference. Instead of just wandering, he said, please help me. I think that's a wonderful way to deal with people who are imposing values, and start asking them questions. My family, my wife and I, had a terrible problem with nearly our best friends when they suddenly became very addicted to a given religion. And when we went to them, what we got was their religious values imposed on us. And I discovered that the best answer was to just ask questions. But then I discovered that by my asking my questions, it became rather embarrassing, so I had to back off on asking questions. So ultimately, we had to give up talking because I couldn't win or lose. Couldn't win either way. We couldn't get it. But this business of thinking that this is the right thing to do and everybody else has to behave this way is oppressive. The word wasn't oppressive, but it was close to it. Okay, what else have you got there?
There are a lot of pre-cert teachers in the room, so I'd like to ask this question. Who or what influenced you to enter into the education field in the first place?
Oh, I guess for the other teachers, I think was the big thing. Many of you get around to reading my book, Romances with Schools. people are calling it a memoir. It wasn't intended to be a memoir. It's a memoir about schooling and the changes that took place in schooling in Canada and the U.S., what schooling was like. And I had an extraordinary second grade teacher. She was just, after having a first grade teacher that I didn't get along with very well, but she was just absolutely extraordinary. And she loved books. And I loved books, and she contributed significantly to my love of books. And then for the first time in the fifth grade, I had a male teacher. And he was a very compassionate human being. And the school didn't have a gymnasium or any place to go when it rained, and in the Northwest it rains occasionally. And we discovered it was great to stay in at recess time at noon if he would let us do it. He would often be there, and we'd get talking. Those were the big things, and then so that is the beginning. I think they were the factors. I didn't have a teacher in my own family at all, and I'm the only one in my family now who's a teacher. But it was other teachers.
Thank you. So what do you think we can do as teachers to support and defend democracy in schools, and what does it look like, and how do you do it in your content area?
Ask me a tough one. Well, you're going to do it in a content area primarily anyway, because I don't see in the near future today's teachers are going to be dealing primarily with that and certain kinds of content in particular. But let's start early. Let's start with nursery school. I was responsible for the laboratory school at UCLA while I was there, and we had a nursery school and a kindergarten. And we had a teacher in the nursery school, a male teacher named Jimmy Nations, one of the best early childhood teachers I've seen. And when he'd take the children out on the playground, and children would get in a quarrel and use nasty language with one another, he would immediately blow a whistle, take the whole class back inside, sit them down on the carpet, and they'd begin to talk about were there other ways to solve problems besides yelling at one another and fighting with one another. And this is pretty basically democratic. And he did it right in the nursery school, teaching them you can solve problems without having to beat up on people. So that's one way. Another way is to quit having in the classroom contests, academic content contests, where the same children are always going to win. That happens over and over. When I was in school, we had spelling bees, and the same kids won all the time. And that, youngsters know when they're not doing well. They don't have to have it rubbed in that way. But what I would be even more concerned about is moving out of the classroom. I'll give you a couple of examples. I'm not avoiding the question, but there's a bigger one, and that is about how we go about making our schools democratic institutions. Had you ever thought at all about the fact that when children first go to school, which would be kindergarten, if they don't meet the age for starting kindergarten, they have to wait another year? This is the most undemocratic thing we could possibly do. I can't think of any other than that. What happens? It means that kids who don't get admitted, then we've got a range of income and social and economic capital. And affluent, doesn't matter, it's going to cost them now, but they're going to send their children to preschool. Those who can't afford it aren't going to do it. If there's any way to help children not being left behind, it's to change the time, the practice of when we admit them. The interesting thing is, what the biggest obstacles are to this? Teachers. It upsets their standard way of doing things. I've been proposing that youngsters start on their 5th birthday, or for me it would be the 4th birthday. Every child is entitled to 16 years of schooling. They started on their 4th birthday. Or if that's too daunting, you're having youngsters coming in, straggling in, at least during the month of their birthday. So you get 5 or 6 kids coming in during the month of January, and you have a party. You celebrate them. Had you ever thought of the fact that when kids come into kindergarten, you've got such a long period of getting the class organized and functioning properly? You'd have kindergarten functioning properly all the time, because the social climate of the class would already have been made. A group of youngsters comes into a social and cultural environment already. You don't have to count on it being a bit of accident. That is one of the most undemocratic processes we have in schools, and I don't have much hope that's going to change. Because I talk to teachers, they said, "Good grief, you mean I might have a group of teachers coming in January or something?" Yeah, and they'd come into a non-graded situation as well. And that frightens teachers, and it's too bad, because we ought to be taking care of that in their education. So there are all kinds of indications. I have written before and stated before, you can make more major changes with schooling by quit doing things than you can by doing things. Quit doing things. A lot of things we do because they're fashionable, always been done. We don't think about it, we just do it. Excuse me. So, another question, and we'll make this the last because my voice is getting out.
I would actually like to end this evening with a thank you note from an audience member, Lori James, and I think that speaks for all of us. And for those of you who didn't get your burning questions answered, once again, tomorrow night in the CEP, 6 p.m., Critical Conversations will continue the discussion.
Why don't you have those conversations? That sounds...
Okay, John. Thank you for sharing your thoughts tonight. I have read a number of your books and appreciate the wealth of knowledge you bring to education. I also referenced you in my dissertation. Thank you very much, Lori James.